At Rose Research Center, we're working on a number of innovative strategies to help smokers switch to less harmful nicotine products. And one thing that I'm particularly proud of is that we have really taken to heart the message that comes from a modern neuroscience understanding of how addiction develops in the brain. If you go back many, many years, and still to this day, most people have a conception of addiction that I think is wrong, or at least very incomplete and misleading. And that is the view that when people become addicted to a drug, whether it's nicotine, cocaine, or alcohol, that the main problem is that when they try to quit the drug, there's a set of withdrawal symptoms that they suffer through. Now, with some drugs, like alcohol, those can be very severe and even fatal. But with nicotine, they're not fatal, but they can be distressing, anxiety and difficulty concentrating and craving. And the view was that, well, if you just get through a couple of weeks of withdrawal discomfort, you'll be fine. But that was not the case. Even back in the 1970s, before we had any real drug-based treatments to help smokers, and smokers either quit cold turkey or with behavioral counseling of various types, what was found is that smokers could get through the first few weeks often, and then they would still relapse back to cigarettes a month later, 3 months later, even a year later. And obviously the withdrawal symptoms had passed by then. So what we started to learn, or should have started to learn, is that their brains had become rewired so that the habit of smoking became facilitated in their brain so strongly that whenever a smoker runs into a stressful situation, they turn to that familiar source of comfort. And there's a saying in neuroscience that goes back to a neuroscientist by the name of Hebb, that neurons that fire together wire together. And it's almost as if a smoker's brain has been rewired to reach for that cigarette. Now, flash forward to the 1980s, where we did have nicotine gum and then later nicotine patches. And people thought, once again, oh, well, if we just provide smokers with nicotine, say from a patch, we can alleviate their withdrawal symptoms when they quit smoking and they'll be just fine. Well, no, once again, we see that an inexorable relapse takes place over weeks and months, so that in the long run, only about 10 to 15% of smokers will succeed in remaining permanently smoke-free after using something like nicotine replacement therapies. And now, once again, we're learning with e-cigarettes that, again, even though e-cigarettes are better in the sense of replacing not only the drug effect, the nicotine that smokers seek, but also some of the habit components, but we still see that only a minority of smokers will completely and successfully switch from their familiar cigarettes to an e-cigarette. So we started to learn that the habit of smoking is a very specific habit with specific brain pathways that recognize those familiar cues that a smoker associates with their own cigarette. And those get very strongly wired into their brain. And an e-cigarette is a different kind of habit. And it's almost as if, by analogy, one were to go to a happily married couple and say to one, yes, you've had a spouse that's been an amazing source of support and comfort for decades, but now we're going to take them away and give you a new person. They may not, be as smart or attractive or suited to your needs, but the compensation is, since you'll live longer, you'll be able to spend more years with them. And I think by that analogy, you would see that would not be a very effective strategy for people. And in the same way, we can't expect that those brain pathways in the smoker's brain that have been so wired in year after year can just immediately switch tracks and now substitute a new habit, such as an e-cigarette habit. Looking at addiction that way, has given us some exciting and very promising new approaches, though, to how we can help smokers make the transition. And I can mention just 3 of those that I'm particularly proud of that we have focused on very recently at Rose Research Center. One approach is a very simple instruction-based approach, and it's based on the notion that smoking a cigarette becomes much less enjoyable if you've just smoked a cigarette as compared with if you've gone through a period of deprivation. A good analogy would be that eating a meal is much more satisfying if you're hungry than if you just ate a meal. So we've done some studies where we instructed smokers who are trying to make the transition to a less harmful product like an e-cigarette to try to make the transition, but if they feel they must smoke one of their cigarettes, they can do so, but first use the e-cigarette right beforehand to satisfy their craving as much as they can. And then if they go on to smoke their own cigarette, we found they don't enjoy their cigarette. And that smokers who were able to follow that instruction had about 5 times higher success rates at kicking smoking than those who couldn't. And we're working on ways to help them follow that instruction better and better. So that was one simple approach we're pursuing to devalue cigarettes and raise the value of the e-cigarette and reconnect the pathways in the brain so they start to use the e-cigarette first before their combustible cigarette. A second approach is based on a drug treatment using 2 FDA-approved drugs that we found that in combination render their own cigarettes less satisfying, but actually don't detract from the enjoyment of e-cigarettes. And we found in one pilot study with 24 smokers that by the end of the treatment, they were enjoying the e-cigarette more than their familiar brand of cigarettes. We're currently conducting a larger scale randomized controlled trial to evaluate that treatment further. And a third method I'll just mention quickly is an even more innovative approach, which is that we're trying to develop compounds that could be incorporated into a safer nicotine replacement product that a smoker wouldn't even notice are there as long as they use just the nicotine product. It could be a nicotine lozenge or something of that nature. However, if they do light up a cigarette, the chemicals that are in smoke will react with the compound that we incorporate into the nicotine lozenge and generate a very bad taste. And so that would help, again, reverse, not only equal the playing field, level the playing field between conventional cigarettes and e-cigarettes, but again, make conventional cigarettes unappealing and help smokers to develop the new habit that they need to replace combustible cigarettes with the nicotine lozenge or e-cigarette, whatever the nicotine product is that we're trying to switch people to. So these ideas have come out of that modern view of addiction, which is different than the simplistic model that nicotine withdrawal is the only problem. It's really a neurologically based habit that is the problem in addiction. And that habit that is wired into the brain does not get forgotten or go away without specifically addressing it. So I'm particularly happy and excited and proud of the fact that we are focusing on that approach, which has basically been overlooked by most of the researchers in the field.